Good evening. Good evening. We want to get started. Just let me get started in 2 minutes. I just want to make an announcement outside to get as many folks as I can in here, and then we'll get started. Is Dr. Rock waiting? And he's on his way. He's prepared. Yes. Hold on. I should put on some roller skates. Yeah. Most of the folks are gone. We want to get started. We're going to get started. Okay. Okay, we want to get started this evening. We have the illustrious Dr. Rock here for a seminar, Protest and Progress. This is the book that he wrote. I'll pass it around as we begin our seminar, and it will be tremendously enlightening, and it is a tremendous, it's tremendously appropriate to end our African Heritage History Month with Dr. Rock and this subject matter. So let's bow our head for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for being our Lord and our Master. We thank you for this wonderful Sabbath day where we can come together and fellowship with you and fellowship with each other. Now, as your servant, Dr. Rock, presents the subject matter, Protest and Progress, be with him, dear Lord, and be with us. Let everything that is said and done here be in accordance with your will. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. Rock, it's good to see you. Sharon, it's good to see you, Sister Rock. It's good to see both of you here, and we're going to share the screen, and the time is yours.
Seeing you in heaven is a delight. We own you both, and we love you, and we're happy to see you back on the West Coast. I know you enjoyed your stay on the East Coast, but we're still welcoming you back home. And what a wonderful place to land at Valley Crossroads. And I can tell that you're enjoying it, and we hope that the both of you will have a chance to stop by soon so we can sit down and fellowship. But this is not about fellowship. It's about a discussion regarding the book. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll try to give an overview, and then we'll have questions, and we will extend the program to whatever extent you wish, but usually within an hour or so, there is that capability. Again, the title of this book, printed by Andrews Press, released in 2018, is Protest and Progress. And it is all about the journey of Black Seventh-day Adventists from being isolated in the church to where we are today. From being isolated to where we are today. And we're going to talk about how we were isolated and take those steps or engage some conversation. And we'll ask your questions as we go along. If you have questions while I'm talking, just raise your hand or say just a minute, or however, get my attention, and we'll hear the questions. But certainly when I finish, you will have questions, I hope. So let's begin at the beginning.
And we need to share our screen.
And now we're going to share the screen.
yet.
We want to enable the screen sharing. I'm being guided by my engineer, and she's pulling me back. I'm like a racehorse. I'm ready to go, but we do need to share the screen. So,
To share
Pastor,
our screen.
to share our screen.
Our
There we
screen.
go. So, Pastor, your engineers will have to help us. How are we doing?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Here's the goal. And thank you. The very first slides.
We're not there yet.
All right. I'll pause.
One moment.
All right. I'm informed that we're ready to go. Protest in progress, Black Seventh-day Adventist leadership, and the push for parity.
Something happened. Hold on.
Screen and sharing has stopped.
The window closed.
We'll go at it again. God has blessed his people. We've come a long way
Hold on just a
Yeah.
minute.
from
please.
slavery until today.
I have to
And I'm
share
anxious to
screen.
tell you about it if I can.
Yes, we will. I don't know what stopped it, but let's get it back. Continue to talk, please.
So
Who's controlling it?
we'll
Harada or
get
you?
to it, but the technical difficulties need to be conquered first.
Yes.
You have to talk some.
All right.
And
My,
then I'll get it.
my engineer here by my side, who does all of my direction for this kind of thing,
We will have it
is
fixed in
talking
a
to me. Her
minute.
name is Sharon K. Kelly Rock.
Amen.
Um, we've now been married for 3 years as of
Amen.
last month. And I know so little about these electronic wonders. I've not even tried to learn. I just call her name when I'm in a fix, and she's the one that pulls me out.
Dr. Rock, they used to call me the Helen
So-
Keller of computers.
Telling me again. And here, we're almost there.
Yeah, we have the geniuses.
Not sure,
Test mic check.
but coming.
Test.
And while I'm at it, I want to thank you for that prayer for the war zone for the
Yes.
Ukraine that was read in the service today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor Knight.
You have been there,
That
correct?
was
You've mentioned there many
Translated
times.
to us, and we've been able to share it already.
Dr. Rock, you've been there many times to Ukraine as vice president of the GC.
No, I recall. I do not recall going to Ukraine.
Okay.
I have been to Russia
Yes.
more than once, and I'm a little surprised to see that the Ukraine, I guess I shouldn't be, but in Ukraine, they have more churches and more members than they do in all of Russia.
Yes.
But of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is very strong in Russia. I had my meeting in Siberia, in Novosibirsk, and actually the Russian Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, tried to shut me down. Went on the newspapers and they appealed to to the public not to come. But we baptized well over 1,000 people
Amen.
in that meeting in June of 92. And I've been back once or twice, if I recall twice, to visit with them and love the Russian people. But I'm not sure about Ukraine.
Okay.
And what I sense, however, is that they are not as orthodox Russian in
Mm,
their religion, and they are more open to the West, and therefore we've had a more robust presence in Ukraine.
yes.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't be praying for the Russians as well, but certainly we can remember the 431, if I remember correctly, churches we have in that country.
Wow.
So now, are we ready, everybody?
Yeah, we're ready. We're on the screen.
We are. Protest in progress.
Can they still hear?
Are you with us, Pastor?
Yes, we're with you.
Are they seeing the screen?
Arado, are we ready to go?
Is the
We're ready to go.
screen visible?
It's on you, Dr. Rock.
Protest in progress. We'll move along. The next slide tells you that protest in progress is an overview of the four major attempts of Black Seventh-day Adventists in the North American division to achieve parity or equity, some would say equality, in both membership and mission. I begin with this historical overview of the, pardon me, of the situation in the U.S. and in the church from 1865, the end of the Civil War, and the year 2000, which is as far as our book tried to give a review. And on the left-hand side, you see the U.S. history, which includes slavery from 1619 to 1865. Then what I have termed the Southern Recovery from 1865 to 1896. And then Separate but Equal, which was put in place in America from 1896 and which lasted to 1954. These are historical periods in our country. And then the civil rights movement that followed from 1954 to 1968, when King was assassinated. And then what's happened since then, or what happened from King's assassination to the year 2000, when we entered into the new millennium. Now, if you look on the other side, the right-hand side, I want to point out the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church during each of these historic periods of the nation. Where was the Seventh-day Adventist Church during slavery? In fact, there was no Seventh-day Adventist Church, but there was what we call the pre-Adventist Church. That was the church of the Millerites, where Ellen White joined in the early 1840s. And she and the other remnants of Millerism who were disappointed in 1843 and 1844 when the Lord didn't come, they still longed for the coming, and they studied and prayed, and God gave her a lot of visions. But the Sabbath did not come into their view until the late 1840s. And this early Millerite residue was very much anti-slavery. Miller was an abolitionist, and his followers were also abolitionists. They wrote about it, they had publications, they preached, they taught, and there was no doubt that these people, the Millerites, who expected the second coming, were very much opposed to slavery. Then during the Southern Recovery, the second period on the left-hand side, from the time that the Civil War ended until 1896, when the United States voted in separate but equal, the South had been defeated in 1865, but they recovered. They didn't go to sleep. They didn't quit. They kept working. And by 1896, they were successful in getting the US government to establish separate but equal. Now, separate but equal simply meant it was illegal. It was against the law for whites and blacks to come together in worship, in study, in marriage. Of course, that lasted until the 1960s, what they call miscegenation. But it was illegal from 1865 until 1896 in a social way. It just wasn't written. But in 1896, they wrote it up. You could not attend a white church or a white school. Now, what did our pioneers, the early pioneers, Adventism began, they organized in 1865. How did they relate to what was going on during those years of Southern recovery? They, like the Millerites before them, were anti-segregationists. They were hard on the Southerners who took out their anger as a result of losing the Civil War upon the black families who had been freed but didn't have anywhere to go. Didn't
They
have
closed that tree. So what did you do?
I just left it in the car.
Oh,
Didn't
there's
have-
another one. We can go over
Don't
there.
they all close at the same
I
time?
don't know. They probably have different.
The early pioneers during this period were very, very hard early Adventists. In fact, the first Adventist president, John Byington, had been a part of the Underground Railroad. So here we see slavery, Southern recovery, early Millerism believers and early Adventists were against slavery and against segregation. Now, what happened? In 1896 to 1954, when the government said you can't come together, how did our early leaders react to that? They, unfortunately, and you can't be too hard on them, maybe, because the law said that if blacks came into their churches, they'd be put in jail or they'd have fines. And the Ku Klux Klan would have started hanging them just like they were hanging blacks all those years, or most of those years. So our church leaders said, well, since the government says we can't come together, we will not have blacks and whites worshiping together. And this was the beginning of trouble. The beginning of trouble. Ellen White had already said in these periods that were preceding, it's okay. You should worship together. You should go to school together. But when she saw that the government put out a law, separate but equal, in 1896, she said it's better that the blacks work for blacks and white works for whites. And our white church didn't do anything about that. They didn't fight it. They didn't struggle against it, but they succumbed, and they call it gospel expediency, and said it is expedient for us, if we're going to do evangelism, not to let black people come into our congregations, our hospitals, or our schools. So that when the civil rights movement broke out and blacks led by Martin Luther King in 1954, when he came to prominence about the time that separate but equal was annulled, and it lasted till 1968 when he died, the civil rights movement itself, our church leaders still held on. And they said, look, the law of the government says blacks and whites can't come together. So no, you can't come to our schools. They let a few into PUC and one or two into this school or that school. My late father-in-law, Elder Peterson, was in the first graduating class at PUC in 1916 or something like that. And he wrote his first book in the 30s, but he was one of very few. Andrews was accepting what they call quotas, and very few could go anywhere. And in Loma Linda, you couldn't go at all in some of those early years. As our church maintained a strong position that said gospel expediency, you can't come here. In 1968, at the end of the civil rights movement, when King was assassinated, until the year 2000, the next 32 years, our church leaders, even though the government said in 1954, no more separate but equal, Dwight Eisenhower put out the statement, the nation knew no more separate but equal. It's okay to go to white schools. It's okay to go to white churches. It's okay to be accepted into white hospitals. Our Adventist brethren did not move on that. They just kept on with gospel expediency until 1965. When they put out the first statement, it said, no more. We need to desegregate the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The first time they said it. Stop this quota business. Stop closing your churches to blacks who want to come in. Stop this business of not hiring blacks. And at that time, we saw a movement beyond 1965 that very slowly began to open up, that built to where we are today, so that in the late 1970s, we saw people put in office like Elder Bradford in 79, who became the president of the North American Division, and a lot of other good things happened that we'll come to in a minute. And as a result, there was an early adoption, but without personal compensation to some people and some other distorted activities and positions that made it difficult. And these we will address as we move forward. But before I do so, are there any questions about this overview of where we have been under the direction of the culture and the rules and laws of the country? How Adventists have reacted? Any question to that?
What does it mean, early adoption without personal compensation?
Yeah. What is intended here is to suggest that there was, even in 1965, the church began to adopt, but there was not a lot of personal interaction, and it took a little longer for us to become thoroughly ingratiated and accepted.
Excellent. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
We'll move. Any other questions? Let's go on to the next slide. I'm sorry. I thought I heard someone, but we'll move. The next slide. Here's how we address the situation. In those early years, there was a push for full participation. By 1900, just 4 years after separate but equal became the law, there were about 100 Black Seventh-day Adventists. There weren't many of us in 1900. And by 1928, we had maybe a couple of thousand. In fact, we had 3,000 or so in that period, but still too few to do a lot of protesting of the situation in which we found ourselves, which was separate but equal. And our members couldn't attend white churches. Our young people couldn't go to white schools and colleges, except in a few instances where they took just 1 or 2. And we couldn't go to the hospitals and so forth. But there was an appeal that lasted until 1928 for full participation, where our brothers and sisters said, don't treat us like this. We want in. We want in. But then came the second protest. The first protest didn't work. The second protest said, well, if we can't get in and be on the conference committees and have authority at constituencies and be paid like everybody else. And that's a part of that full compensation that you ask about, Pastor Knight. Didn't get paid the same even. Since we can't get in with full participation and full compensation, let us have our own black conferences or colored conferences. And that was an appeal that was formally made in the 1929-1930 era and lasted until 1944 when they were granted. Then came the third protest. Around 1969, the membership had grown to the point, and the funding had grown to the point, and the administrative expertise had grown to the point where our black leaders said, well, in order to function, we've got these eight black conferences, and in order to function efficiently, we need to be in the same union so we don't have to talk across union lines. And we can pool our resources, not only our little money, it wasn't much then, but our money and our talent for the progress of the work, for mission where we live. And that failed, as did the first push for full participation. The push for colored conferences succeeded. But then came the fourth push, and this was a push for equitable retirement security for reasons that we'll get to when we get there. But I'll just say this, it worked, and it's working very well. And today, as a result of that equitable retirement security push, the conferences where this applies are doing very well with their retirement arrangements. And that's a beautiful story that too needs to be told. So these are the four specific protests. Full participation didn't work. Colored conferences did work. Black unions didn't work. Equitable retirement did work. And we'll flesh them out in some detail. But do you have any questions? Let's go back to that slide again. And you tell me, is there any question about the historicity or the historical connection and sequence of the four major protests? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next slide. And this is the first slide with some detail of the push for full participation before black conferences were organized. And may I say, before black coordinators were organized on the Pacific Coast and the North Pacific Union. The Pacific Union and the North Pacific Union do not have conferences, black conferences, but they have blacks in leadership position called coordinators. But before we got those coordinators to speak for black people on the West Coast and black conferences to speak for them in the rest of the country, there was this push from 1898, right after Separate but Equal was started, to 1928. Colored status under this regime was blanketed by the theory of gospel expediency. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, under its conservative social policies and practices, issued denials in all these ways you see: membership in churches, schools, hiring, hospitals, employment, equal pay. That was the issue. The next slide. Because of that, there were a lot of hindrances to mission, to what blacks could do. There was a waste of valuable talent, discouragement of black members, discouragement of potential members. We lost a lot of blacks who would have become Seventh-day Adventists during these decades. But they said, why should I belong to a church like that when my church, the CME, Colored Methodist Evangelists, or Episcopalians, or AME, or the black Baptist conventions or the Black Pentecostals or whoever they were. And by the way, 60 or more percent of all blacks in America who are Christians belong to these denominations. We who are members of a so-called integrated church are in a minority, but they want to know, why should we join these people when the blacks who are Seventh-day Adventists can't even get the same compensation? They can't get on the committees. They can't go to the schools, pray tell. Why are we going to belong to a church where there are white churches we can't even join when we have our black churches and our black denomination? We don't have that problem. So it was difficult, and the consequences included discouragement of potential members and a defection of a lot of colored leaders. I'm coming to that in a minute. A lot of our primary preachers said, I can't take it. And they left during this period of the first protest. Among those individual protesters were McKinney, C.M. McKinney, who protested at a camp meeting in 1898. Louis Sheaf, who was a very popular lawyer who became a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church around 1900, who protested to Ellen White herself, as did Dr. James Howard, a popular physician in the area, and as did J.K. Humphrey toward the end of that period, who was pastoring in Ephesus in New York City, who left the church with about 600 of the 1,000-member congregation and started his own Sabbath denomination. The next slide shows you other major protesters who defected. Among them, John and Charles Manns, who left the church in 1915 from the Savannah, Georgia area, started their own Sabbath denomination. Louis Sheaf, that same brilliant lawyer who protested to Ellen White, left the church in Washington, D.C. He came back into the ministry and went into the pastorate in Los Angeles, but then out there he found it wasn't much better, so he left permanently, as far as we know. And of course, as I mentioned, J.K. Humphrey, who left around 1930, and Anna Bontemps of New York City, who was one of those elegant and highly erudite and educated blacks in the city of New York in the time when Harlem was the Jerusalem for black intellectuals. Finally, after a few years of teaching at Harlem Academy and later on at Oakwood, left the church and became a Lutheran and died outside of the church. He was brought up into the Adventist church. He did go to PUC for a while, but he's one of those blacks who couldn't take it and who during this early period or during this push for equity left our fellowship. The next slide also details that there were pushes in 1909. They were not by a group, but by a few interested and a few very strong-minded blacks who approached our brethren. And in 1918 was a second appeal, which resulted in W.H. Green becoming appointed to head the burgeoning Negro Department, which had just begun in 1909, when we had 1,000 or more members. But now, in 1918, he, of course, assumed the direction for all the black work, which still didn't give us equity or equality, because his office was in Detroit, Michigan. He lived in Detroit, Michigan, but his office was in Washington, D.C., where he couldn't function because of prejudice. And the poor brother worked so hard, he finally died after about 10 years in the job in 1929. But all of that is a part of the ugly history of what our brothers and sisters endured during these early years. Then in 1929, right after the death of Elder Green, the denomination said, well, we will doodle differently. We will listen. And the second appeal was made. And this appeal this time was official. And the brethren listened to it, and the brethren considered it, but they stretched it on out till 1944, some 15 years later before it happened. And let me show you now some of the details of how that occurred. There was the appeal in the 1929 era, and not another official one until 1943. But in between that, in between these appeals, as you see in the slides which now follow, there was a lot of activity. The colored membership grew to 17,780 by 1943. Government legislation was beginning to loosen up, separate but equal, which was established in 1896 and finally annulled in 1954. The groundwork, the foundation was being loosened by certain set-asides and by certain presidential edicts. And in 1943, there was a Lucy Byard incident, and this was another catalyst that helped provide the Black Conference movement or the Black Conference reality. This light-skinned sister who was moved from New York to Washington by her pastor, Elder Cox, with the thought that she would be admitted in the Adventist sanitarium. But when they found, although she was light-skinned and they couldn't determine it at first, when they found that she was Black, they moved her over to Freedman's Hospital, and she died there several weeks later. And that infuriated the brothers and sisters, the Black brothers and sisters around the Washington, D.C. area, and they organized the Committee for the Advancement of Worldwide Work among Seventh-day Adventists at that time. Dr. Evie B. Dykes, the second woman to receive her PhD, Black woman in America, but the first to be confirmed, was a part of this committee, along with a lot of other very staunch and dedicated members, men and women, but very, very significantly, mostly women, who were the primary movers of that committee who protested the Byard incident. Other significant events included the organization, well, this was it. The push for colored conferences resulted in the organization of the first Black conferences in Lake Region with headquarters in Chicago, and Allegheny East with headquarters at Pine Forge. Now, on the West Coast, it didn't happen. There are reasons for that. Good reasons at that time. The first reason was that Elder F.L. Peterson, who had been moved from the General Conference Negro Department leadership a year or so earlier, had been put, well, he went out in the early 30s, but in 1942, just a year before the final decisions were made to start the conferences that began in 44, he had been made the Black secretary for the Pacific Union. And that was wonderful. All of the believers, and there weren't that many, at this period in 1943, there were approximately 1,800 Black members on the Pacific Coast. That's all. They were mainly concentrated around Oakland, in that area, and LA, and a few other main cities, but there weren't enough, they weren't having enough trouble. There was trouble on the West Coast, but they hadn't had the same problems that Blacks had had in the South and in the East, because there wasn't that much of an intimate association of Blacks and whites. It was Blacks with Asians and with Latin Americans and all kinds of races. So the Black-white issue was not as tense. And plus, as I said, Elder Peterson had just been made the Black secretary for the whole Pacific Coast. and people were sort of happy. And a lot of people who were leaving the South, remember, this was during World War II, and blacks were in that great second migration. The first migration was in the period of the First World War when blacks left the South and moved to Chicago, Detroit, and so forth. But now it's the second migration, and thousands upon thousands of blacks from Texas and other places where there was a lot of racial tension moved to other cities in the North and West. And when they got out in the West, they didn't want to talk about any colored conferences. They were just glad to get out of the cotton fields of Mississippi. And they were glad where there was freedom and palm trees and sunshine and fresh air. So it wasn't a big deal on the West Coast at all. And so when the vote was made at the General Conference and the North American Division that we organize these conferences in the other parts of the land, out here, our brothers and sisters felt it was not a necessity. These are the conferences that were organized in the year that they actually began to function. One conference, the Allegheny Conference, which was Allegheny Conference, later became Allegheny East and West, with West in the Ohio and that part of the country where those states are, split off in 1967, and the South Atlantic Conference, which went into operation in 1946, also split, and they were separated from the conferences in Georgia and the Carolinas and Tennessee and so forth. And the one in Florida, which is the Southeastern Conference, also a regional conference, the last one to be established in 1981. Now, before I go to the black unions, and I'm going to carry you through some detail here as well, is there any question? Let's go back to that last slide. Is there any question as to why these conferences were organized, or when they were organized, or why there was not one on the West Coast? Carrying on. The third push was the push for black unions. This push began in 1969 and it lasted until about 1980 and was also refused in terms of black unions being established, but it was successful because it affected a lot of other important changes. And let's go through a bit of the detail. Some of the precipitating events included the amazing growth that was occurring amongst the Black Seventh-day Adventists in the United States. And again, there were events in the government that were catalysts, trigger events, we call them, that inspired black leadership to ask for unions. They included all the things that had occurred as a result of the civil rights movement. And now blacks were moving into positions in the country and they were acquiring a little bit of wealth. There was movement from the lower class into the middle class and even into the upper classes of the United States. And there was a little more money coming into the church. And our brethren felt that we should have our own black unions where we can harness all this and we can do mission better than we've ever done before. But the church was not ready for it. In fact, leadership gave a few tentative statements and desired to encourage the black workers to move forward with what we had. And I can personally attest, because I was a part of this, and we were given promises and prospects that could have, had they worked, that could have bettered things immeasurably, but it was impossible for them to take place in the atmosphere of the country at the time, so they didn't work. But still, there were the appeals. In 1969, Again, in 1970, there was what was called the 16 points, telling us how the work could be better. And then in 1976, there was a second appeal after the first one or two incursions or thrusts had been turned down. And what happened then was what happened as all this was going on, and you should see this, was not only a division of black Adventists and white Adventists, but black Adventists among themselves. There were two brands of black leaders: the integrationists, who said, no, we don't want unions. That's going too far. The next thing you want is a division. And after that, you want a whole general conference. So let's don't start this union business. On the other side, there were what I've termed in the book as a self-determinationist. These three people, Bradford, Cleveland, and Dudley, were in philosophical conflict with Banfield, Canson, and Hale. And it was a fierce debate. It wasn't only white and black, but you should have heard these brethren debate their position. And I, of course, being very close to Earl and Frank and Warren, and by this time the president of Oakwood College, while I was siding with the self-determinationists, I understood the integrationists because my mother, Eva Bradford Rock, who died in 2010, was a big layperson who pushed against black conferences on the West Coast. And she worked hand in fist, as they say, with Earl Canson, who by that time, in the latter stages at least, had become very, very prominent on the West Coast, and Major White, my other good friend, two brothers slightly older than I, but I understood their position against the unions. They felt that it was a bridge too far, and our self-determinationists, Bradford, Cleveland, felt, and Dudley, that it should be done. And the next grid shows you how they debated the matter. And if we had time, I'd give you everybody's philosophical position with their principle, their means, the benefit, and the risk. But I'll just take two. Earl Canson, Elder Canson, my good friend. His principle was unity. He said, we don't need these black conferences. It's going to destroy our unity. And we can get that unity by association. And if we get black conferences, now black unions, it's only going to disturb the association between blacks and whites. And the benefit of having this unity is togetherness in the Lord. But there was a risk, and that risk was tokenism, as many of us felt, that some blacks would be accepted, but white flight would mean that the majority would leave, and there'd only be a token integration or desegregation affected. Well, contrary to him, let me see. I'll give you one of the desegregationists. And well, there's Cleveland, right? The second name listed. Cleveland's big thing was practicality. He said, well, yeah, unity is good, but let's be practical. You're not going to have any unity in this country where the black and white churches are going to get together. Even in the same city, are they going to get together? You can talk it, but is it going to happen? And then he also said that we can get this conference, this union together by just a little administrative accommodation. That's all we need. We don't want to be off by ourselves. We just want a wheel within a wheel and an administrative accommodation. And the benefit will be self-determination, where we can decide ourselves what to do with the work. Because make no mistake, the union is the most powerful structure in the organization. Our whole denomination rests on unions. That's how you choose delegates at GC time. So for Cleveland, it was a practical matter. But there was a danger to his proposal, and that was separatism. The very thing that Canson and Banfield and Hale worried about. separatism and having two camps and perhaps someday a separate church. So you can go through each one of these and find the good and also find the weaknesses. I must say that Hale, who was among the integrationists, changed before he became sick as he was leaving and going in after he had retired from his role as a provost at Ohio State. He changed from the Worthington Church, which was white, to the Columbus, Ohio Black Church, and he became a party to the self-determinist position, which said, yes, these conferences are necessary and these unions would be good. You might have some questions here, and I'll pause. Are there any observations or questions that you have so far? You got it?
Yeah, let's
We'll go.
continue.
The significant events that occurred in this push were the decision of the leaders of the North American Division and the General Conference against it, even before it went to the GC committee. And then the decision of the blacks who were involved to put together a little paper called Together for Finished Work. And the brethren said, no, you said, well, since you won't listen to us leaders, maybe you listen to the pews. And by this time, I had been in Oakwood for about 7 years. And while I wasn't a president of a conference, I was studying at Vanderbilt and had some little tidbits of philosophy and sociology that I was able to contribute and was proud to do so. And they asked me in 1978, just before the final vote was taken, to write an article on the affirmative for black unions. And another brother in Washington, D.C., Alan Anderson, who was a scientist there, and an Oakwood graduate, a black brother of faith, just like the rest of us, but who was against the unions, to write the position of no. So in 1978, in September, if I remember the year, there was an article written by Calvin B. Rock saying, yes, we should have it. And there was an article written by the scientist, government employee in Washington, no, we should not. And that precipitated the final vote. And the final vote that was taken was negative. No, we don't want this because it's going to interfere with our brotherhood. And who's to say, and I think I can say more than that. I believe that even though we didn't get them, the offshoot of it all, the benefit of it all was worth the debate. And you see here in 1979, some of us decided, well, if we can't get black unions, what we'll just get is territorial councils. And that was another name for black unions anyway, except that we didn't plan to pull out of the present unions, the contemporary unions, but we would have some territorial councils that would allow us to talk about the work and better facilitate mission, because it was a fact that our white union presidents, and that's all we had when this first came up, that white union presidents were not capable in most instances of being able to properly advise black workers. They didn't know. We needed indigenous leadership, not alien leadership. And there was a big divide that, well, they can learn. And I mentioned my mother, she and I had some big debates about this. She was a leading proponent against conferences and against unions. And her son and her brother, Elder Bradford, who died recently, were both on the other side of the fence. So it was an exciting time. It was an exciting time. And in the book, if you buy it, you will see her position and the letters that she saved and gave to me that described the debates about this on the West Coast, particularly in the Southeastern Conference, but in Southern California as well, and how things worked out. I won't get into more detail, but buy the book. It's a great debate, and thank God it all worked out well. Finally, in the fourth protest, there was a push for equitable retirement. Now, why did these black brothers in these conferences, these 9 conferences, decide they wanted a different retirement system? Let me explain. First of all, they figured it out. They said, look, we're giving the same amount of retirement money that our white conferences are giving, 9% or 10% of our income. So they were giving 9% of the 60% of white income. Let me get that. Black Americans, not only in society at large, but in the church, make 60 cents approximately every time a white citizen or Adventist makes $1. But we were giving 10% of our 60, while they were giving 10% of their $1. And our 10% of the 60 was going to help these white brothers and sisters who were living longer than we were living. And you know, whites live longer than blacks, 4 to 6 years then and even now. So they said, what's going on here? We're giving the same out of less, and then we're dying younger. It's not fair. They also remembered that their liquid assets were not the same, that many white workers came from families with houses and lands. And even while they were in the ministry, they had backing that a lot of poor blacks didn't have. My grandfather, Elder Charles Bradford's dad, died in 1957, if I remember, during a general conference, and we had to take up an offering to bury him. I put in a measly $45, but we had to put in the money to bury my grandfather. Black pastors back in those days, in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, didn't know anything about, they didn't think about investments. They didn't think about putting money into bonds and stocks and accruing money for some long period of life. So there was intergenerational wealth that was being passed down. And there was a matter of jobs, that we couldn't even get a job in some institutions where white Adventists were working, but they were refusing to hire blacks. Opportunities in our schools, opportunities in our hospitals, and again, the matter of investments. When I went to the Southern Union as Associate Secretary of the Ministerial Association in 1967, I came out of the black work where I'd been hired in South Atlantic, and I'd worked in Lake Region, and I'd worked in Northeast in 3 black conferences. And I was amazed to find that my white brethren who were running the Southern Union were investing in houses and lands. In fact, they have streets in Decatur right now named after some of these brethren. And all of this was eye-opening to the black leadership. And when they discovered that they were, in fact, disadvantaged in these regards, they said, we need our own retirement system. So, as the next slides go, there were conversations in 1998. The Black Caucus, made up of the black leaders, engaged the North American division, asked for a change. The Black Caucus was told, no, you can't pull out of the retirement system. You pull one thread, it'll all go to pieces. This is a wage scale event or necessity as well, a part of the whole fabric, and you can't get out of it. But they decided in 1999 to go to an independent study, and they got some outside counsel, and still the black brothers were refused by the North American Vision, said you can't do it, but since you persist in asking, we'll take it to the General Conference president, which is what they did after going through all of the other hopes, all of the other hoops. And we'll go back, and I'll say one last thing about this before we go to the concluding section. When they met with the General Conference president in 2000, he was wise enough. He was wise enough to say, to ask them, now, if we don't give this to you, what are you going to do? And one of the black presidents said, Mr. President, if a bus is going in the wrong direction, there are only two things to do. You continue in the wrong direction, you turn and go back to where you came from, or you get off the bus. That's all he said. And that shocked the brethren, knowing that there'd never been a successful move to divide blacks into a church of its own. But that shocked the brethren, and it was with great wisdom that the brethren said, let's take it to the body. And when they took it to the whole General Conference, they voted it as recommended by the North American Division, and the regional retirement began. People thought it was going to fail, but it hasn't failed. Today it has about 700 participants and some $200 million banked up. And I retired on the General Conference retirement, and I'm okay. You know, we're able to live, but that retirement back there, and it's one reason we have a hard time getting some preachers coming to the West Coast, and we have a hard time keeping them on the West Coast, because that retirement back there is about $1,000 or more a year, pardon me, $1,000 a month in excess of what we get. And as I said, we're doing okay. God is blessing us, but it's a very attractive plan, and it's working exceptionally well. Well, so much for the 4 divisions of protest. And before we go to the last couple of slides, I'm through for the moment anyway, and I'm going to ask you, Pastor Knight, if you or any of your leadership and members have questions about anything that has been covered.
Yes, they change it. There's a regional retirement. Do you have that answer, Dr. Rock? When we retire, what percentage of our salary do we get?
Oh, no, I don't. I don't. I don't know what, I guess that could be found, but I do not know that.
I know
when
it's
I
more
retired,
lucrative in the regional conferences. That's why there is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rock, there has been a diaspora of experienced black pastors from the West Coast to the regional conferences because of the regional retirement. So you have experienced pastors bolting back east, and you have less experienced pastors coming this way. Is that correct?
now, my good pastor friend, that may be the case, but I'm not prepared to give any statistical confirmation of that. I do know that that retirement system is very, very attractive. And I've heard a lot of preachers talk about being where it happens, but I'm not sure as to the extent. And I'm careful not to say that is affecting or effective in any way in what's going on between the East and the West. But yeah, it's very attractive. It's very attractive. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some who would refuse to come West because of it, and some West who'd like to go East. In fact, some of the white conferences have said, or state conferences as we call them, why can't we have that as well?
And some of those state conferences, they wanted to merge with the regional conferences because of the retirement, or merge their retirement systems. Is that correct?
I've heard that.
Yes.
I'm not privy to any details, but I have heard that. But again, let me say, And I'm one of those who retired on the GC plan. Let me say that you can live. You can live on what we're living. Uh, yeah, you can live.
In
I
Las
managed to get
Vegas.
a house paid for,
In Las
and
Vegas,
I don't have a lot of money in the bank, but got a couple of nickels and a pretty good health plan. And my wife and I, we're able to get along. We're able to eat 3 squares. Of course, I eat twice a day, so I don't eat 3 squares, but we're able to make it, and we thank God for it. So we don't feel oppressed. But on the other hand, that's a mighty attractive thing they've got going on over there.
Another question, please.
The question I just have is that I know that California real estate is very high compared to other parts of the country. How do the conferences on the West Coast help the pastors with their housing compared to the pastors on the different parts of the nation?
I barely heard what was said. Can you wrap it up a little bit? Wrap it up
The question was
so I
that
can hear. I heard something, but I didn't get the question.
the question was that real estate in California is very high. How does the conferences or the ruling bodies help the pastors in the regional work acquire property?
I don't know. When I moved to Las Vegas in 2000, I was just leaving the General Conference after 50 years of service. And I pastored in Las Vegas for 9 years. I pastored in Phoenix for another year and a half. But I was not engaged in the pay scale. I was on the GC pay scale. So you'll have to help us with that, Pastor. I don't know.
The reason that I have a wife that works. If you have to have two incomes, and when you have two incomes, we got into the real estate market years ago, so we were able to get a little something. But I don't know if they help with real estate at all for pastors.
Well, if you don't know, my good dear brother, you need to ask right away. You may be missing something.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Dr. Rock, why
but
don't you
I'm
give
not
us
sure.
the last phase?
What's that?
Why don't you give us the last phase?
All right. Here we go. The challenge ahead. What are we going to do? Do we still need regional conferences? Yes. Not only do we need regional conferences, but we need regional coordinators. We need both. And the reason is that blacks are still a minority in the country. And whereas we have now become an equal in membership totals in the division, we are still a minority in many of the structural arrangements and certainly in finance, and need the focused vision that we get from our regional coordinators. And I speak of Elder Childs, and I speak of the others who work with him in the various conferences, but he, as our union coordinator, he would serve in a comparable position as a regional president. But Virgil Childs has a black budget and a black secretary. I dare say, I don't know, but most of them do. And they have a black camp meeting in all these conferences, and they have black workers meetings. So we need these black caucuses. We need these black caucuses, East and West. And we need them for very good reasons, some of which I've detailed here. Let me give you just a taste as we go along. Some say, what about unity? Well, we still have unity. We have doctrinal unity, but we don't have cultural unity. And that's what makes whites worship mainly with whites and blacks with blacks. Sometimes blacks will morph into another culture, and that's great. Well, that's fine. People ought to go where they want to go. But the vast majority of blacks have a culture which has to do with music and preaching, which makes worship in black churches, and therefore the need for regional coordinators as well as regional presidents or regional conferences. The next slide, and I'm going to not go into all these details. Some say we're living in a post-racial colorblind society, but we're not. Anybody who thinks that this country is colorblind is culture blind. The American society is not a melting pot, it's a flower garden, and we got a lot of different cultures. And when we have a strong culture with a prominent minority, that group needs coordinators and presidents. Some say, well, love overcomes everything. Yes, love overcomes all. Love does not overcome, pardon me, cultural barriers. I love all of my brethren of every culture, but I don't love all their food, and I don't like all their dress, and I'm not attracted to all their worship. So I can love them even though I differ. Regional conferences reduce fellowship. No, not really, because in the city where I live, white Seventh-day Adventists have no closer relationship to the black congregations than they do in Pittsburgh or Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. Culture is culture, and we have to learn to live with the differences of culture and not flagellate ourselves and beat ourselves up because we're not homogenized. Black and white cultures are not mixed up together where we become assimilated. We're different, and we ought to be able to accept that and let the indigenous leadership that we get from regional coordinators and regional conferences go forward and not feel guilty. There'll be no separate conferences in heaven, thank God. But Jesus also said there'll be no marriages in heaven. But we're not going to break up our marriages because it won't be in heaven. We have to do what we do under these present circumstances. All right, there are other considerations that are sociological as well, and some of these we've already hinted at. And we must know that one of the reasons that our church, and I'm so glad for Black History Month, but one of the reasons that evangelicals and Adventists are considered a part of the evangelical church is that one of the problems with the evangelicals, what is it? Evangelicals. Thank you, Sharon. Of evangelicals is that we have taken the theology of the upper class, which is not concerned with the problems of the lower class. And as such, social justice has been left out of our theology, so that the theology of the evangelicals says that when Jesus described his mission as releasing the prisoners from their incarceration and breaking the yokes of oppression, he was talking about spiritual bondage being broken and spiritual slavery into which we have been placed by birth, really. But he wasn't talking about spiritual bondage only. He was talking about social bondage. And we must support justice campaigns and protests, not only in society, but in the church. And they are not advised and they're not structured by our white brothers and sisters, usually. Now, this is not exhaustive. This is not for everybody. There are many white brothers and sisters, not only in the church, but in the society about us, who are wonderful. I know some and have great association, but the majority, as we see in the bombing, the threatened bombing of black colleges and universities, and the continued thrust to restrict voting, and the denial of the set-asides, including affirmative action, and in all of the other ways that we notice in our society that the poor get poorer unless they protest, we can see and we know that many evangelicals find themselves on the wrong side of history by feeling that the Lord is going to take care of that when he comes again. And what we need to do is pray and not get involved in politics, and just pray and don't worry about social injustice. It'll all be over soon. But that is not the answer for you and for me. And it is another reason why we need these caucuses to plan and to discuss and to structure ways to overcome the disadvantages which we have faced and which we still face. So what has the result been on the East Coast and the West Coast from having regional coordinators and regional conferences? An amazing growth in membership. Here, the latest statistic was from 2016, but we're way above that now to 400,000. 9% when we got started and 33% now. And the same is true with our tithing. $500,000 in 1944 and 184 million in 2016 and 326 million today. It's working, brothers and sisters. It's working. And here you see a cut of the pie, how it looked way back there. And as again, you see the difference as has been stated. So regional conferences, and may I add, regional coordinators are not expressions of thirst for power or retaliation or arrogance or pride. They are a means of providing indigenous leadership in the communities where we live and serve, rather than alien leadership who do not know the problems of our communities. I think that the big thing that should be on our plate today is the relationship that we have among each other, not so much among whites. That's fine. Let's continue that. But we need to have better relationship of blacks who were born in America with blacks who come here from Africa and the Caribbean and from other places. And we need to harmonize our worship periods so that they structure not only good Adventism, but also good music. And when I say good music, I mean music that is not offensive, music that the angels can enjoy singing. And that music is different, but it should not be the extremes to which many of our churches have gone. We must also be concerned about the growing trends of black SDAs to join the state conferences. A lot of money is leaving black churches going elsewhere because of some of the things we're doing in our services. A lot of young people, they're even leaving the church because they don't understand. And we must be concerned about the growing trend of black SDA churches to ignore initiatives relative to the spiritual development of our youth. In particular, I speak of Christian education. I would like to propose that the answer to our problems is not mixing, but fixing. And that what we must be about most of all is fixing Christian education. It's a shame, a crying shame, to talk about closing up LA Academy. It's a shame, brothers and sisters, with all the churches we have, with all our pastors who should be preaching sacrifice and have enough strength to rally our people. And we can't blame it on white people. Every time we close up one of our schools, I dare say it's our fault, not their fault. We can do it. And this is where we ought to be placing our emphasis. So the next major protest for Black Seventh-day Adventists might very well not involve racial freedoms or authority. More likely, it should include vigorous attempts to improve relational issues within the Black community itself, as well as initiatives for the education and salvation of our youth. After all, charity does begin at home, and in the present climate, it is not mixing, but fixing that most requires our attention. I've talked about the fixing. I've tried to put it to you the way I've understood it to go. I hope that it has opened some thought, and I hope you have some questions. But, Pastor, the slideshow is over. We'll hear from you.
Dr. Rock, I want to thank you so very much. This was a magnificent culmination of our